Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this panel, where we are about to embark on a fascinating journey through some pages of the Bible, the book that has shaped our Western culture. Perhaps you can ask, what does the Bible have to say about the theme of this Oxford convergence, that is solitude and belonging, or loneliness and true companionship? Well, in order to understand it, we'll go through some stories from the New and Old Testaments with the help of two well-renowned biblical scholars, colleagues, and I hope I can say good friends of mine, whom I will now introduce. At my right hand, John Barton has been the Oriel and Lane Professor of the Interpretation of Holy Scripture at the University of Oxford until his retirement in 2014. He is priest in the Church of England and Fellow of the British Academy. His book, A History of the Bible, the book and its faith, is a bestseller and was shortlisted for the 2020 Wolfson History Prize in the UK, and was adapted for radio and broadcast on the BBC radio 4 years ago. At my left hand, Walter Moberly has been professor of theology and biblical interpretation at Durham University until his retirement in 2022. He's also priest in the Church of England, and he's known for his creative, accessible, and provocative writing and also talking. I can testify that it's a delight and a challenge to talk to him. He's always concerned with the continuing relevance of the biblical text today, as one of his last book, just one of them, his book, The Bible in a Disenchanted Age, the enduring possibility of Christian faith, shows from the very title. So I would like to introduce the first topic of our dialogue, focused on the first chapters of Genesis, with a scene of the film Meet Joe Black, following the saying, a picture, nowadays a video, is worth 1,000 words. So let's watch it.
Now I gotta go, so...
Yeah, understood.
Okay, all right.
Fair enough. See you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
When the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone, I will make him a helper as his partner." It's a quotation from the second chapter of the book of Genesis. Well, in the scene we have seen from the film Meet Joe Black, the director brilliantly shows this tendency that constitutes us structurally. I am made for a you. My fulfillment, my happiness, is not fulfilled in isolation, in autonomy, but in the relationship with a you. By nature, we'll have a tendency towards the other, a tendency inscribed in our flesh and in our spirit, physiological, psychological, soulful, and I will even say religious, since in our structural need for a you, the person hides the constitutive opening towards the divine you. This is a dynamic that is illustrated very well in Adam's expression when he first sees the woman before him. This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. Quotation from the second chapter of Genesis. In a way, we could say that we, unlike the animals, experience loneliness as a demand, a cry for companionship. Now, I believe that no one here is unaware of this paradox that occurs in the experience of love. This tendency toward the you, toward the loved one, often turns into pretension, possession, violence. Already the third chapter of Genesis expresses it well when Adam, after the fall, unloads his responsibilities on his wife, Eve, by blaming her. He tells God, I quote, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit from the tree, and I ate." Final quotation. So, John, let me address the first question to you. What can we learn from this creation story about the mystery of the relationship between man and woman as a privileged place of true companionship? Why does the place where we touch paradise, the affective relationship, so often become hell, or less dramatically, a cohabitation pact between two people who are once again alone or isolated from each other, as we can see in the that's the right slide, as we can see in the Hooper painting Room in New York. You have the floor.
Yes, I think that what you learn from Genesis 2 is the complementarity of the man and the woman, that each has to have the other. They're not identical, but on the other hand, they are alike enough for one to have the relationship with the other. And the whole story in Genesis is of the balance between them being separate beings who can accuse each other of being to blame, and at the same time, similar beings who therefore can understand each other. And I was reminded of the piece of Jewish interpretation of the saying, thank you. There's the saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, which of course is quoted in the Gospels. A Jewish interpretation of that says it should really be, you should love your neighbor who is one like yourself. And I don't think that's true, right, as a historical interpretation, but it is quite interesting that someone saw it that way, that the reason you love your neighbor is that they're like you. But of course, in the case of the couple, Adam and Eve, they're also unlike each other because one is male and one is female. And it seems to be the interplay between likeness and difference that we need in order to have a relationship with someone. And we can't manage just on our own. We're not sufficient. And there's an English hymn which has a line, "Heaven is not heaven for me alone," which I think expresses rather well this sense that we need other people. And what we have to do is to be in relationship with them, but not to absorb them into ourselves. The suggestion that Eve is taken out of Adam physically, of course, is a legend, but it's a clever way of expressing the sense that they somehow belong together and are related to each other. Plato did it rather less elegantly in the idea that the original human beings were spherical, like a ball, and then came apart and each one was looking for the other half all the time, which is a rather crude way of expressing a rather similar idea, but I think Genesis is a bit more sophisticated than Plato in that particular respect. This raises the question, of course, of which is much debated in all countries of Europe and certainly in Britain, about marriages between people of the same sex. And one objection has been, well, they're not sufficiently different. But on the other hand, they are different because they're not the same person. And it seems to me that in looking at this, we're not perhaps operating with absolutes, but with some kind of spectrum in which people have to be other, but at the same time have to be alike. And that perhaps expresses itself across that divide. But that's a controversial matter, certainly in the churches at the moment. It is interesting, as we just heard, how this complementarity can end in mutual recrimination and hatred. And we all know this. We all know people who have married for years and have hated each other for years and continue to do so. And this we see already in Genesis 2, where, or in Genesis 3, where Eve says, Adam says, Eve made me do it. And Eve says, the snake made me do it. And if there were any other characters, it would pass around. There's a wonderful painting, or rather a sculpture, in Chichester Cathedral near the south coast of England from about the 10th century, so very early, which shows Adam pointing at Eve and Eve pointing at the snake, which is a nice pictorial representation of just this thing of trying to push your responsibility onto somebody else. And I think Genesis sums that up very well. Questions about whether Genesis is historically true as a piece of reporting, to me, don't arise. It's a clever legend, but it's one that expresses lots of profound things about human relationships and about the avoidance of isolation and relationship as an alternative to just isolation, as I think you were suggesting in the beginning. So that would be, there's just some thoughts about this passage. Walter, probably.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, just on terminology, I think we really struggle with finding a good term for the early chapters of Genesis. Is it myth, legend, or what? And I know John avoids the word myth because it has the trouble that scholars use it as meaning a profound symbolic story, and there's the popular use meaning a myth's a load of old rubbish. And,
yes.
True. So
yes, I wasn't using it to mean rubbish. I was using it to mean a profound story, but it's a story rather than a piece of history.
Oh, indeed. But the trouble is that the one word too easily slides between the two.
Yeah.
Just one or two words on that second question about how the close relationship can so easily become hell. It does seem to me that our culture is less good than it might be on, as it were, sort of the disciplines needed in making relationships work. And one of the problems with sexual intimacy is that it can give a quite deceptive appearance of being close to someone, because obviously the bodies are close, but the heart and mind may be very far away, particularly if it's just, sort of you only met each other that evening, you've gone for a date, but you don't know that person, let alone trust them. And so when you bring on, sort of the heavy drum beats of sexual passion, the sort of the subtler notes of actually getting to know someone's mind and the way they work get drowned because, the heavy drums are beating. But of course, it's those subtler notes that are the ones that actually are going to matter more in the longer term. I mean, for what it's worth, in traditional Christian understanding, a marriage, people make a commitment to trust each other, to give themselves to each other. And then that is consummated physically, i.e. the sex you're coming together is the summation, as it were, of other things that have gone on first. And of course, our culture has rather quickly, easily reversed that. And, there's no easy going back on that. But one can so easily miss the things that matter. And that can be at least, I think, one of the factors in relationships not lasting, or if people are stuck in them, they don't be what they should be.
Thank you. Let's move to the second topic of our dialogue. Eric Varden, Norwegian bishop and monk, writes, I quote, "Is being alone bad for your spiritual health? The English language makes the very useful semantic distinction between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is a negative condition, one in which I feel deprived of company I want, perhaps ardently yearn for. Solitude, meanwhile, is a state of being alone, enabling me to touch the depths of who I am, as Frederick Painting brilliantly expresses, in order potentially there to discover a resonance with the world in whose image I was made, who decides to become flesh in me, drawing me into the peaceful life of the Blessed Trinity, which is communion." End of quotation. Well, in a materialistic culture like ours, in which it is claimed that we exist by chance, or what we are merely the result of purposeless evolution, can we continue to affirm that solitude is a place of encounter with the divine mystery that creates me and that dialogues in the restlessness of my heart? But the Bible, in one of its opening stories, goes further. In Exodus chapter 33, we see Moses going in and out of the tent of meeting, the main place of worship and encountering God, while the Israelites wandered in the desert. In this mobile tent, says the text, I quote from the chapter 33, "The Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, as one speaks to a friend." End of quotation. In this case, I address this first question to you, Walter. Is true friendship with God possible on the basis of our condition as a creature? How it is possible to find God in solitude, thus overcoming loneliness? Does the experience of solitude have anything to do with our condition as creatures? Or, to put in another way, or important way, does this mean that we should not run away from solitude? You have the floor.
Thank you. For what it's worth, I found read in the newspaper, it was the Times a couple of months ago, a feature by James Marriott, who's, I think, one of their sort of more creative columnists. He's always worth reading, where he talks about the importance of true solitude. And he's not a believer at all. He's made that quite clear in some of his other columns. But he says, for example, loneliness is a scourge, I agree, but solitude, voluntary, genuine, well-used solitude, is one of life's high pleasures, and one that is at present rather underrated. Now, my impression here is that he particularly likes solitude because it's good for thought. You can think things and not simply be led away by the herd online or whatever. You get a bit of sort of space to think. But it's striking that you don't have to be a believer in any way, I think, to see that solitude may be something different from loneliness. But what is the difference? And how does it relate to this striking biblical passage about Moses being a friend of God? Because, of course, being a friend of God it's an odd sort of thing, because clearly, being with God isn't like being with another human being. It just ain't like that. And yet, there's an enormous wealth of testimony down the ages that friendship with God is meaningful. People not just deceiving themselves, but having something that's there and real and life-forming. I think one of the issues is that Jewish and Christian faith have always understood that knowing God and knowing oneself go together. So that coming to know God will be very difficult or impossible if one's own self is, as it were, blocked up. And a certain opening of oneself, to ourselves as well as to God and others, is necessary. St. Augustine famously came to the understanding that God was closer to him than he was to himself. The trouble was Augustine, had been distracted. He'd thought he was there, but actually, he was doing X, Y, and Z, thinking about this, that, and the other, constantly distracted, whereas God was there, as it were, waiting to be known, for Augustine to open himself in some way to the reality of God. And solitude is, in a certain sense, giving that sort of space and time so that one can be less distracted than we so easily are, and realize, as I think we know in important relationships in life, that it's not sort of what you achieve. There's a certain sense about just being with someone. I remember, it was when I was an undergraduate here, a very long time ago, my grandfather visited my great uncle who lived in North Oxford. And it was the last sort of half hour of the visit. And I went into the room where they were. They weren't talking, they weren't reading, they were just sitting together, two old men, probably in their 80s or even early 90s or something, but just sitting together. And at the time I thought, that's a bit odd. But over the years I come to think, maybe there was something about that, the companionable silence, being with someone, a certain kind of solitude, but in company. And I think what we can see there between humans can also be between us and God.
Yeah, thank you there. I thought similar things, that this distinction between solitude and loneliness is very important, that neither is about being on your own. Being on your own in itself is neutral. It could be good or it could be bad. You might be on your own because you have no friends, or you might be on your own because you want to get away from your friends for a bit and have some peace and quiet. And both are perfectly positive things. It's not being on your own that counts. It's, as it were, what you do with it. And I think the distinction between solitude and loneliness is in that sense very important. It also doesn't depend just on actual physical quietness or noise. There's a certain thing, certainly Christian tradition of spirituality, that you must be silent and spend a lot of time in silence, and then you can get to know God, perhaps as a friend. And there is a lot in that, and most types of prayer start by being very still and quiet. But it does rather favor introverted people, that way of praying. And extrovert people often rather rebel against it and say, no, I need some noise. And that isn't necessarily wrong either. It's possible to be lonely in the middle of a lot of noise. It's possible to be in solitude in the middle of a lot of noise. It's what you do with the state you're in. And it doesn't mean that people who are very good in silence are therefore better people than those who are very good in noise, I think. It's rather an important distinction. And you can learn actually to blank out noise in order to think. I grew up in a household where the television was always on, and I didn't have a room to do my schoolwork in, so I had to do it with the television on. And I'd learned to blank it out so that I didn't notice what was happening on the television. And I could experience the kind of solitude, even though I was in the middle of a noisy environment. And that's also an important thing to be able to do sometimes. So I think we ought to not, as it were, exaggerate the importance of actual physical quietness. Personally, I like some peace and quiet, but I do like things going on as well. And I think that's normal. And Christian ideas about solitude often build on a sort of ideal of complete silence. And of course, some monastic orders practice total silence, but it's not for everyone. Otherwise, the world would stop.
I mean, can I just very briefly add, of course, that this is also a place for music. That some music is important as a kind of mood music to get you in a certain frame of mind.
So our third biblical passage coming from the New Testament this time, and that's the scene of the disciples of Emmaus. Listen, Hannah.
You know it well. Something doesn't work. You're tired and you can't do it anymore. But suddenly you find someone's gaze in the crowd, a human gaze. And it's as if you've come close to something divine that was hidden, and everything suddenly becomes easier.
The two disciples of Emmaus that we see in this wonderful painting by Caravaggio, the National Gallery, London, have invited their mysterious companion on the road to dinner because of the experience they had a few hours before, when they were the way, sad and suffering the loneliness generated by the lack of meaning, by doubt, the skepticism that their Rabbi and Master Jesus was not really the Messiah. Having just suffered a violent death on the cross, they met a man who made them understand why it all happened, who gave them back meaning. They found true companionship, as the film Andrei Rublev by Tarkovsky brilliantly puts in. It is as if you have approached something divine that was hidden, and everything suddenly becomes easier. John, again to you. In our world, another kind of loneliness is also growing. The absence of meaning, not understanding what I live for, not finding an answer to the desires and questions that constitute us. On the other hand, the disciples of Emmaus experience a chance, we can say a chance encounter with a traveler who fills them with meaning and joy. This happened 2,000 years ago. So I ask you, it is possible for it to happen again? Can we encounter in our history, in our daily lives, such a real companionship, a companionship that surprises us, in which you come, quote, close to something divine that was hidden?
I think that's a very important further dimension. We looked at solitude, we looked at loneliness, we looked at friendship, and I think this story gives us the idea of companionship, where the people walk along together, and through the presence of the risen Jesus with them, they actually experience companionship with each other. that they're already together because they're both disciples of Jesus. But in the moment when the risen Lord reveals himself, they are drawn close together still. But the companionship doesn't fall into the category of necessarily a really close friendship. Just as for us, we don't have, you may have 300 friends on Facebook, or if you still use Facebook, which I know is now extremely old-fashioned, but you can have 300 friends on it, but they're not friends in the literal sense of the word. They are people with whom you enjoy a certain measure of, I would say, of companionship. You're compatible, you get on. And that is a guard against loneliness and isolation of a different kind from really close friendships. Someone who pretended to have 300 close friendships would be deceiving themselves or trying to deceive you. And most of us only have a certain number of really close friendships, but we do have companionship in this sense that we have a common purpose with a lot of people and we know them in different contexts. And if we didn't have that large circle of people with whom we have good relations, though not very close ones, our lives would be impoverished to that extent. Interestingly, in this story, in the Gospel of Luke, the recognition that Christ is with them and uniting them comes at the moment when they eat together. And this, I think, is obviously a reference by the Gospel to the Eucharist, to taking Holy Communion in the Mass, whatever one calls it, where symbolically food is the thing that binds everybody together. And that, of course, we know from experience. You come to a gathering like this and you eat together and you bond in a way that you don't if you don't ever have meals together. So I think there are quite a lot of interesting themes in this passage. Also, you see in the story the centrality of the idea of blessing. That what happens is Jesus takes the bread and blesses God for it in the Jewish way, where you say, "Blessed be God who's given us this bread." And that expresses the idea that God is everywhere in all things, including the bread you're about to eat. It doesn't make it holy. It recognizes that this bread is the means through which people come together. So I think there's quite a rich story. If you read it, you will find that there are lots of themes in it related to the question of how human beings relate to and understand each other.
Thank you. Just to take a slightly different, more complementary angle on the story, one of the oddities about that story of Jesus walking with the disciples to Emmaus is how much they know and how accurately they know it. When they get talking, they say, "Oh yeah, they were disappointed. They had these hopes in Jesus, but they've been told by women that there's an empty tomb and that angels have said that Jesus is alive." Now, you would have thought that's as good as it gets in terms of, sort of testimony, and they're miserable. In a sense, they know the Easter story, and yet it hasn't clicked. They're sort of, And it seems to me that the story's at least in part about the question of how do you move from sort of accurate knowledge of stuff to understanding, something that clicks, that makes a difference. Now I get it. And in a sense, the first thing that Jesus does, it's interesting to think what he might have done. You see, he doesn't suddenly say, "Hey guys, it's me." He doesn't introduce himself like that, or say, "Well, I've just come back from the dead and I can tell you astonishing things and that'll make all the difference." He points back to something they already know, Israel's scriptures. And what he does is sort of reframes something they already know. So again, something they know but need to see differently. So they know stuff about, well, Jesus is risen, so angels say, but it hasn't clicked. But he goes back to something else they know, but re-narrates it, retells it, reframes it so that they get a different angle. And then, of course, you might expect, but when Jesus gives the Bible study to end all Bible studies, their eyes should be opened, and they're not. Because it's only at the meal when there's a sort of a practical action that meets their need, of which, of course, Christian communion is a sort of a symbol. It's when something happens and is done, then their eyes are opened. So, in a sense, the story, again, in sort of Christian shorthand, it's about learning to see scripture in a way that it comes alive, rather than just sort of knowing the stuff that's there. But that it can be the practical action of doing something to meet a need, sharing in a meal, that can actually be the thing that really makes the difference. It's not just in the head, it's what we do.
And recognizing, what's happened and kind of recognizing each other is a quite a subtle process. So the stories in the Gospels on the whole are not of sudden, explosions in which everything becomes clear, but of people gradually realizing truths. It seems to me that's true to how you get to know other people. You don't, on the whole, there is such a thing as love at first sight, but the majority of people's relationships develop gradually, not in terms of sudden blinding flashes of inspiration. And if you suddenly think, I've seen in the last 2 seconds the most wonderful person in the world, you are probably wrong. You might be right, but it's not. There's not a very large chance that it's right. It normally takes a bit longer than that.
Yeah.
Well, let's come back to the Old Testament, to a story, a narrative that we have to recognize that it's not working now, so we have to read it because we cannot take it for granted to this passage. And we are talking about the first verses of the book of Ruth. So we listen and we read.
In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me." Then they wept aloud. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Naomi said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her.
What is most surprising in this story is Ruth's decision. Her sister-in-law has done what anyone will expect. She has the right, we say, after all, to find a new husband and have children. There is something extraordinary about Ruth's position. She was willing to give her a sense of home and her economic security and cast her lot with someone whose own fate was bitter and uncertain. How it is possible to love like this for free? On the other hand, the situation of Naomi, a widow who has also lost her 2 children, is reproduced in our society. According to the statistics, I quote statistics from the ONS, There were 8.4 million people living alone in the UK in 2023, equating to 30% of all households and 13% of all people living in households. Half of all people living alone in the UK in 2023 were aged 65 years or older. In 2022, there were more than 400,000 people living in care homes in UK. England's overall homeless population in 2021 was almost 275,000. On this total, road sleepers, that is individuals who sleep outside on the streets, doorways, benches, etc., were almost 4,000 on a single night in autumn 2023, a number that has risen for the second year in a row. Well, we all tend to think that it is the state or public administration that should take care of all those elderly people who are alone without a family. We say nothing obliges the rest of us citizens to do so. So, Walter, is Ruth's position, that is, take care of her mother-in-law for free, possible among us? In other words, is absolute gratuitousness possible? Where does this gratuity come from? What are we lacking in our society that prevents such bold and daring decisions? Or perhaps we have to ask ourselves, what value or desire did Ruth see in Naomi that she wanted to follow her?
Thank you. It's a story about the mystery of the human heart. Of course, we spend most of our life making rational and prudential decisions, and that's right and proper. I'm all in favour of rational and prudential decisions, but not all the time. What Ruth does in committing herself to Naomi doesn't seem to make a lot of sense on most levels. It's an astonishing act of generosity. We sometimes think of, St. Francis of Assisi as the most, it's one of the most popular of saints. I mean, when he first started, his father was appalled that he should give up everything and do something so daft and counterintuitive as give up all his wealth. And Ruth's commitment to Naomi was, it looks like, a commitment more to Naomi than to her God. I mean, it's a commitment to Naomi and Naomi's people and Naomi's God. It's not, I'm going to find the true God with you. I'm going to go with you and be, clearly she got more than she was expecting. Perhaps, sort of delightfully surprised that by following Naomi, she came to know Naomi's God and something wonderful that she hadn't imagined. But in terms of this importance of what I want to call sort of the mystery of the human heart, may I briefly add in another story, not a biblical one, but from Tolkien, from The Lord of the Rings, which I hope is a familiar story. Because Frodo, in taking the ring, was doomed to failure. When he was still at the very beginning of things, at Bag End, when he talks with Gandalf, and Gandalf is realizing that it's a ring of power that Frodo has, he tells Frodo just to throw it into his fireplace to warm it up so that they can see the writing. And Frodo can't even do that. He struggles to throw the ring into his own fireplace, where the ring won't be damaged, just warmed for the writing to be visible. How on earth would he ever be able to throw the ring into a fire that would destroy it when he was going to be at the end of his tether? But in that context of discovering the nature of the ring, they also talk about Gollum. And Frodo says, what a pity that Bilbo didn't kill that wretched creature. And Gandalf says, pity? But it was pity that stayed his hand, and it was Bilbo's pity towards Gollum that meant that Bilbo himself didn't suffer from the ring. And then in due course, Frodo and Sam meet Gollum, and, Sam is greatly dismayed and, sort of good common sense, get rid of him. He's really not a good guide. We can't trust him. He's utterly treacherous, and that's absolutely right. But Frodo shows pity, shows mercy. And at the very end, Mount Doom, Samath Nor, Frodo claims the ring. He is finally overcome by it. And he's delivered by Gollum. Gollum doesn't want or mean to be merciful to Frodo. He wants his precious. But in getting his precious, he saves Frodo when Frodo has been overcome. And Frodo's mercy towards Sam is deeply counterintuitive. It's a mystery of the human heart. Why be merciful to such a miserable creature as Gollum? And yet one of the things that runs through, that's a key theme of the Lord of the Rings, is in the language of Jesus, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. And I think that's very close to what we see in the story of Ruth.
Yes, I think that the book of Ruth's always been read as a symbolic story in a way. It's not just a story about Ruth deciding not to go back to her own country, as though that was just an interesting fact in itself. It's always been read, certainly by Jews and Christians, as symbolizing, well, in the Jewish case, symbolizing becoming a convert to Judaism, actually. That there are medieval discussions of Ruth which say what Ruth was doing was showing us what it means to become a Jew, to actually take on board the law and to do all the things that the law commands. And that's symbolized by her saying that she will go wherever Naomi goes. She'll follow the same spiritual path as Naomi. And Jews and Christians both read the story in that way in the Middle Ages. And you'd actually find quotations in Christian sources from Jewish commentaries on this passage, just because they could all see that it was not just an interesting legend from the past or an interesting piece of history from the past, but actually symbolized what it's like to move in this sense from one religion to another, or from one kind of allegiance to another, from trusting where you are to being willing to trust a new place. And I think that's quite interesting, that it's always been read in that way, never just as a piece of narrative about some unimportant events that happened at one time, but as actually summing up a kind of willingness to follow a new path altogether in religion, in life, in all spheres.
Thank you. I think we have enough time, 10 minutes for question. It's an opportunity for our panelists to develop their wisdom. Mm-hmm. So we have some questions over there.
Thank you very much. And I find very interesting the story of the Lord of the Ring, and because it says a lot about our human heart. And then clearly, because we all agree that the Lord of the Ring is a legend, is a story, it's a fairy tale. Then initially, we also heard that Genesis, so chapter 2, quite important. Genesis, I guess, is one of the most important book in the Old Testament. And the story of this creation is a legend. It was clearly qualified as a legend. So then think about, okay, what about Noah, the ark, the story of the ark? Could be a legend, could be a fact. Then there was a story about Exodus, lots of stories in the Old Testament. So my question is very simple. My interest would be, as a believer and a scientist, I would like to know what in the Old Testament, legends and facts. So in your, to all of you basically, what do you think, do you believe are facts and legends?
This could keep us here for quite a long time. I mean, my short answer is it's in one or two things. It's important not to get hung up on labels, myth, legend, folk tale, saga, whatever. We struggle with good words to attach to ancient narratives that don't work according to our conventions.
Yes.
You know, we have conventions. This is history, this is fiction, this is whatever. The ancients don't work according to those conventions, and we struggle, therefore, to find good terms to depict them. I think the other thing I would say is that we can see very clearly in our own contemporary culture that story, literature, or story on the screen, the big or the small screen, literature and reality literature can depict reality in many different ways. And in our culture today, we don't blink because we're accustomed to the conventions. So we don't pick up a novel and say, well, I don't think any of this ever happened, so I'm wasting my time. You know, we say, but how does this story probe reality? What truth does it tell, or not, as the case may be? And it seems to me important to recognize that the biblical writers have the same degree of sophistication and flexibility in the way that they write and depict truths about the world, which may not fit, and clearly often don't comfortably fit, into our categories of ancient history, science, or whatever. And we shouldn't try to fit them in there, but to say maybe reality and truth are being depicted in a different way, which we need to learn how to sort of tune into. John?
I mean, I think when I use the word, when talking about the story of Ruth, for example, the word legend, I was trying to say whether the story happened or not is not the point. It's just as Walter's example of a novel. When you read a novel, you don't say, well, this book is useless because the things it says didn't happen. You know that's the kind of book you're reading, and you get a different kind of truth from it. And I think that's true of a lot of the stories in the Bible, that they are important for what they tell you about deeper realities. The early Christian writer of the 3rd century, Origen, says, who would be so foolish as to imagine that God literally planted a garden and put the first 2 people in it? The story is obviously a symbol. And that's in the 3rd century. And quite extraordinary that you know, that difference is clearly recognized then. And it's what we would call a difference of genre. When you read a novel, when you go to a play, you don't ask, did that really happen? You say, what do I learn from this about human nature or human life? So it's to use the word legend, when I use it, I'm not intending to say the story is only a legend. I'm saying the story is a legend. Amazing, wonderful. That's just what we need. Now, of course, there are also things in the Bible that are reports of historical events. If you read the books of Kings, for example, you learn about the kings of Israel and when they came to the throne and when they died and what they did. And we know from parallel documents from other places in the Middle East that many of those tales of the kings are true, or at least are what was believed at the time to be true. And they're not presented to us as legends, they're presented as reports of things that occurred. But we need to be able to distinguish the two. So it's not that either everything in the Bible is true, literally, or it's nonsense. It is that things have a different kinds of truth depending on the type of literature they are.
More questions?
I can't place the quote for the life of me, but there is a quote that goes something along the lines of, this is from a story about a war, and I can't remember which one, but it's something like, knowing there is death ahead, take rest and take your silence, pick a god and pray. Okay, it's kind of a dramatic line in the novel it comes from. But the question I have relating to that is, like, what would you say is what strength can someone glean in a time of incredible emotional and spiritual difficulty from stepping aside from the drama around them to look at themselves from the inside and pray to the things that matter to them, essentially?
Well, if I understand what you're really asking, it's to do with this sort of solitude and reflection on a reality and so on. And a lot of people do report that in extreme situations, they find that going into themselves and seeing what's there is part of how they get through very difficult situations. But that seemed to be the kind of thing you were describing or thinking about. But did you say it came from a particular book or particular story? It sounded like a good quotation to reflect on, but I couldn't identify it either. But a similar feeling, I had heard it before, but I'm not sure where.
Probably one of those ancient proverbs or things.
Well, it could be, yeah. Yeah, but all of us have these things. I went to see Hamlet the other evening, and was reminded how many quotations there are in it. And of course, they're not Shakespeare quoting; they're things we've quoted from him since. And you no longer realise it's Shakespeare any longer. It's like that.
I think the only other thing I would add to that in a slightly different way, I mean, pick a god and pray. It sounds a little like, sort of take your favourite chocolate from the box. Of course, the astonishing thing about Christian faith is that it claims that Jesus rose from the dead, and millions down the years have believed that that is true, and that there is still good reason today to believe that. Now, if that is so, then we're given a dimension of reality which really, really matters. More could be said, but I don't think it's simply, you pays your money and you takes your choice. The Christian understanding is no, something has happened wonderful beyond our imagining. And it's a gift, but it needs to be received and entered into.
Yes, I mean, Christianity clearly doesn't claim that the Christian religion is just what we decide it shall be, but that there's a givenness about it which is unnegotiable. Yeah. And I think that's clearly very important. Yeah.
Any other question? Last one. Last one over there.
Going back to our second quote, I think, and friendship with God, can you describe a choice. What that friendship with God means for yourselves, or B, a good quote, a good place, an example, a good novel or whatever, where we could read about this and dig into this more for ourselves.
Could I just, on the first part of that, say, I mean, what that would amount to? We talked about how, I mentioned this interpretation of you shall love your neighbor as yourself, as you shall love your neighbor who is someone like yourself, which is a traditional Jewish way of reading that commandment. And of course, what the Bible also says is that God is like yourself, because it says that humankind was made in the image of God. So that there is a likeness, according to the Bible, between us and God. And that means that it's possible to have a relationship which is something like a relationship with a human being, in a way that there are many religions where that would be actually unthinkable. I don't think, ancient Assyrians and Babylonians who were in touch with the Israelites thought that you could have a relationship with the gods. They were terrifying beings. In a certain sense, we were like them, but not in any way that was hopeful or encouraging. But the biblical books, in many cases, seem to imply that human beings are godlike in some sense. And that conversely implies that God is like human beings in some sense. Now, of course, we then go on to say, well, of course, not in an everyday sense, that there's a special kind of likeness that God has. But nevertheless, it does imply that you're dealing with persons who can be in a relationship with each other in a way which isn't true of all kinds of religion in the world. So I think that's an important addition to our sort of list of things the Bible says about human relationships, that it's actually possible to have one with God, which is not surprising, really.
You asked about what I might want to say, and I don't know if it's appropriate to say this, but some 30 years ago, my first wife, Meredith, had a very uncomfortable pregnancy, and they decided to, at about 35 weeks, to open her up, deliver by cesarean, and see why she'd been so uncomfortable. They found cancer all over her gut. Our son was delivered about 8 in the evening. About 10:30, the doctors spoke to me and said, cancer's all over her gut. It's inoperable. It's terminal. I waited around a bit to see her in post-op briefly before going home. Now, that night I was, in biblical terms, Jacob wrestling with the angel. In fact, I was lying flat on my bed. It wasn't sort of physically dramatic, but I was, lying flat on my bed, but wide awake. By the morning, I knew 2 things. One is that Meredith would die. Many friends prayed for her healing, and I never said, don't bother, God can interpret prayer in all sorts of ways, but I didn't join in. I knew deep in my heart that she would die. And the other thing I knew was that we were in God's hands in a way that's sort of quite hard to describe. It was a sense that although we didn't like what was going on, she was 34 in the prime of life, everything to live for. I loved her utterly. She shared the same sense that we were somehow in God's hand. We didn't understand it. We didn't like it. She lived another 3.5 months and died. And yet that sense of being held was there. Now, words kind of fail. On the first anniversary of her death, I went for our favourite walk, and I have never had a day when I have had such a real sense of God's presence with me as I walked through the northeastern countryside. But there's also practical help. You know, I have chronic health problems. I had a small baby, had no idea what to do, and didn't have the health or strength to do it. People came and made life possible in ways I could never have guessed. So, you know, that, in terms of, for me, that was the sense of, well, I talk about more sort of God befriending me than me being a friend of God, so to speak, but it was mutual. And it was a sense that even in something terrible, there was actually wonder, joy, hope. But, you know, words do fail quite quickly.
Well, what strikes to me this evening is that we are right now learning the right way to approach the Bible, that is to approach the Bible with new questions, as you have witnesses to us with new experience, and approaching in this way the Bible becomes a new book, a book that is plenty of hope for our life. So I think we have learned to this even that solitude, for example, can be an opportunity to go in deep our very nature, that we are created with this tendency to the you. So the question, I think that Walter has formulated in a wonderful way, the struggling of Jacob with the angel. No? The question, who are you, the one who is calling me the restlessness of my heart in this experience of pain? But at the same time, as we have seen in the scene of the disciple of Emmaus, we need God to become flesh. We need a real companionship to make it clear what that is mean, this restlessness of our heart. Of course, I'm pretty sure that Convergence tries to become a place like this one, a place where we can share our humanity or the restlessness of our experiences, and to face everything in life. So it's that's enough. I just would like to make thanks to John and to Walter to this wonderful dialogue, and we have enjoyed. I think I'm pretty sure. So thank you very much.